The Political Compass is a website which uses responses to a set of 62 propositions to rate political ideology in a political spectrum with two axes: economic, left to right, and social, authoritarian to liberal. Hello, and welcome to The Aesthetic Philosophy. In today's video, I'm going to be analyzing the political compass and trying to give an in-depth explanation with as to what it is, how accurate it is, and how it can be used. In order to analyze the political compass, I think that it's important that we analyze what it's based upon, which is the political spectrum. A political spectrum is a system to characterize and classify different political positions in relation to one another. These positions sit upon one or more geometric axes that represent independent political dimensions. The expressions political compass and political map are used to refer to the political spectrum as well, especially to the popular two-dimensional models of it. Most long-standing spectra include the left-to-right dimension, which originally referred to seating arrangements in the French Parliament after the Revolution in 1789 up until 1799, with radicals on the left and aristocrats on the right. While communism and socialism are usually regarded internationally as being on the left, conservatism and fascism are regarded internationally as being on the right. Liberalism can mean different things in different contexts, being sometimes on the left, for example social liberalism, and other times on the right, so conservative liberalism. Those with an intermediate outlook are sometimes classified as centrists. Politics that rejects the conventional left-to-right spectrum is often known as syncretic politics, although the label tends to mischaracterize positions that have a logical location on a two-axis spectrum because they seem randomly brought together on a one-axis left-to-right spectrum. Political scientists have found frequently and noted that a single left-to-right axis is too simplistic and insufficient for describing the existing variation in political beliefs and included other axes. Although the descriptive words at polar opposites may vary, the axes of popular biaxial spectra are usually split between economic issues on a left and right dimension and socio-cultural issues on an authority-liberty dimension. So having given a brief overview of the history of the political spectrum, let's look more in depth about the academic investigation of the topic. For almost a century, social scientists have considered the problem of how to best describe political variation. One of these social scientists is Leonard W Ferguson. In 1950, Leonard W Ferguson analyzed political values using 10 scales measuring towards birth control, capital punishment, censorship, communist evaluation, law, patriotism, theism, treatment of criminals, and war. Submitting the results to factor analysis, he was able to identify 3 factors, which he named religionism, humanitarianism, and nationalism. He defined religionism as belief in God and negative attitudes towards evolution and birth control, humanitarianism as being related to attitudes opposing war, capital punishment, and harsh treatment of criminals, and nationalism as describing variation in options on censorship, law, patriotism, and communism. This system was derived empirically, as rather than devising a political model on purely theocratical grounds and testing it, Ferguson's research was exploratory. As a result of this method, care must be taken in the interpretation of Ferguson's 3 factors, as factor analysis will output an abstract factor, whether an objective real factor exists or not. Although replication of the nationalism factor was not inconsistent, the finding of religionism and humanitarianism and a number of replications by Ferguson and others. Another social scientist was Hans Eysenck. Shortly afterwards, after Ferguson, Hans Eysenck began researching political attitudes in Great Britain. He believed there was something essentially similar about the National Socialists, or the Nazis, on one hand and the Communists on the other hand, despite their opposite positions on the left and right axes. As Hans Eysenck described in his 1956 book, Sense and Nonsense in Psychology, Eisenhower compiled a list of political statements found in newspapers and political tracts and asked subjects to rate their agreement or disagreement with each. Submitting the value questionnaire to the same process of factor analysis as used by Ferguson, Eisenhower drew out two factors which he named radicalism, the R factor, and tender-mindedness, the T factor. Such analysis produces a factor whether or not it corresponds to a real-world phenomenon, and so caution must be exercised in its interpretation. While Eisenhower's R factor is easily identified as the classical left-right dimension, the T factor, representing factor drawn at right angles to the R factor, is less intuitive, and high scores favor pacifism, racial equality, religious education, and restrictions on abortion, while lower scores attitudes tend to be more friendly towards militarism, harsh punishment, easier divorce laws, and compassionate marriage. Despite the difference in methodology and location and theory, the results attained by Eisenhower and Ferguson matched. Simply rotating Eisenhower's two factors 45 degrees renders the same factors of religionism and humanitarianism identified by Ferguson in America. Eisenhower's dimensions of R and T were found by factor analyses of values in Germany, in Sweden, France, and Japan. One interesting result Eisenhower noted in his 1956 work was that in the United States and Great Britain, most of the political variance was submitted by the left-right axes, while in France, the T-axis was larger, and in the Middle East, the only dimension was found was the T-axis. Among Mid-Eastern Arabs, it has been found that while the though-minded and tender-minded dimension is still clearly expressed in the relationships observed between different attitudes, there is nothing that corresponds to the racial and radical conservative continuum. So let's look at the relationship between Eisenhower's political views and his political research. Eisenhower's political views related to his research. Eisenhower was an outspoken opponent of what he viewed as the authoritarian abuses of the left and right, and accordingly he believed that with his T-axis he had found the link between Nazism and communism. According to Eisenhower, members of both ideologies are tough-minded. Central to Eisenhower's thesis was the claim that tender-minded ideologies were democratic and friendly to human freedoms, while though-minded ideologies were aggressive and authoritarian, a claim that is open to political criticism. In this context, Eisenhower carried out studies on Nazism and communist groups, claiming to find members of both groups to be more dominant and more aggressive than control groups. Eisenhower left Nazi Germany to live in Britain and was not shy in attacking Stalinism, noting the anti-Semitic prejudices of the Russian government, the luxurious lifestyles of the Soviet Union leadership, and the Orwellian double link of East Germany's naming itself the German Democratic Republic, despite being, and to quote, one of the most undemocratic regimes in the world today. While Eisenhower was an opponent of Nazism, his relationship with fascist organizations was much more complex. Eisenhower himself lent theoretically support to the English National Party, which also opposed the Hitlerite, or Nazism, and was interviewed by the first issue of their journal, The Beacon, in relation to his controversial views on relative intelligence between races. At one point during the interview, Eisenhower was asked whether or not he was of Jewish origin before the interview proceeded. His political allegiances were called into question by other researchers, notably Stephen Rose, who alleged that his scientific research was used for political purposes. Moving on from that, let's look at how Eisenhower's conception of though-mindedness has been criticized for a number of reasons. Number 1. Virtually no values were found to load only on the though-minded/tender dimension. Number 2. The interpretation of a though-mindedness as a manifestation of authoritarian versus though-minded democratic values is incompatible with the Frankfurt School's single-axis model, which conceptualized authoritarianism as being a fundamental manifestation of conservatism, and many researchers took issues with the idea of left-wing authoritarianism. Number 3. The theory which Eisenhower developed to explain individual variation in the observed dimension relating their mindedness to extroversionism and psychotism, returned ambiguous research results. Number 4. Eisenhower's finding that Nazis and communists were more their-minded than members of the mainstream political movements was criticized on technological grounds by Milton Berkich, or I think that's how you say it. Number 5. Eisenhower's method of analysis involved the finding of an abstract dimension, a factor, that explains the spread of a given set of data. In this case, they were the scores on a political survey. This abstract dimension may or may not correspond to a real material phenomenon, and obviously problems arise when it is applied to human psychology. The second factor is such an analysis, as such the Eisenhower's T factor, is the second best explanation for the spread of the data, which is definition drawn at right angles to the first factor. While the first factor, which describes the bulk of the variation in a set of data, is more likely to represent something objectively real, subsequent factors become more and more abstract. Thus, one would expect to find a factor that is roughly correspondent to the left and right, and this is the dominant framing for politics in our society. But the basis of Eisenhower's though-minded/tender-minded thesis, and the second T factor, may well represent nothing beyond an abstract ideology. Another influential political scientist in terms of the political spectrum was Milton Berkich. Dissatisfied with Eisenhower's work, Milton Berkich developed his own two-axis model of political values in 1973 based on the ideas of freedom and equality, which he described in his book, The Nature of Human Values. Milton Berkich claimed that the defining difference between the left and the right was that the left stressed the importance of equality more than the right. Despite his criticisms of Eisenhower's tender axes, Berkich also postulated that a basic similarity between communism and Nazism, claiming that these groups could not value freedom as greatly as more conventional social democrats and democratic socialists and capitalists would, and he wrote that the two-value model represented here most resembles Eisenhower's hypotheses. To test this model, Milton and his colleagues used content analysis on works exemplifying Nazism and communism and capitalism and socialism. This method has been criticized for its reliance on the experimenter's familiarity with the content under analysis, and it's dependent on the research's particular political outlooks. Multiple raters made frequent accounts and frequency of accounts of sentences containing symptoms for a number of values identified by Berkich, including freedom and equality, and Berkich analyzed these results by comparing the relative frequency rankings of all the values for each of the four texts. Socialists, freedom ranked first and equality second. Nazism, freedom ranked 16th and equality ranked 17th. Capitalism, freedom ranked first and equality ranked 16th. And communism ranked 17th in terms of freedom and ranked first in terms of equality. Later studies using samples of American ideologues and American presidential inaugural addresses attempted to apply this model. So, we've looked at some of the history, but let's look at the later research. In further research, Eisenhower refined his methodology to include more questions on economic issues. Doing this, he revealed a split in the left-right axes between social policy and economic policy, with a previously undiscovered dimension of socialism to capitalism, which is now known as the S factor. While factorially distinct from Eisenhower's previous R factor, the S factor did positively correlate with the R factor, indicating that a basic left-to-right or right-to-left tendency underlies both social values and economic values, although S taped more into items discussing economic equality and big business, whereas R related more to the treatment of criminals and to sexual issues and military issues. Most research and political theory since this time has been replicated in the factors shown above. So having covered the history of the political spectrum, now we can begin to look at the axis models and analyze their pros and their cons, their criticisms and their defenses. Number 1. Greenberg and Jonas, Left to Right Ideological Rigidity. In 2003 Psychological Bulletin paper, Jeff Greenberg and Ava Jonas posited a model comprising the standard left-to-right axes and an axis representing ideological rigidity. For Greenberg and Jonas, ideological rigidity has much in common with the related concepts of dogmatism and authoritarianism, and is characterized by, to quote, believing in strong leaders and submission, preferring one's own in-group ethno-criticisms and nationalism, aggression against dissidents, and control with the help of police and military. Greenberg and Jonas posit that high ideological rigidity can be motivated by, to quote, particularly strong needs to reduce fear and uncertainty, and is a primarily shared characteristic of people who subscribe to any extreme government or ideology, whether it is right-wing or left-wing. Number 2. Engelhardt and the traditionalist, secular, and self-expressionist survivalist. In its 4th January 2003 issue, The Economist discussed a chart proposed by Ronald Engelhardt. It was supported by the World Values Survey and associated with the University of Michigan to plot cultural identity onto 2 dimensions. On the y-axis, it covered issues of tradition and religion such as patriotism, abortion, euthanasia, and the importance of obeying the law and authority figures. At the bottom of the chart is the traditionalist positions on the issues of these, with loyalty to country and family and respect for life as considered important, while at the top is the secular position. The x-axis deals with self-expression issues like everyday construct and dress, acceptance of diversity, including foreigners, and innovation, and attitudes towards people with specific controversial lifestyles, such as vegetarianism, as well as willingness to engage in political activism. At the right of the chart is the open self-expressionist position, while at the left is the opposite position, which Engelhardt calls survivalist. This chart not only has the power to map the values of individuals, but also to compare the values of different people in different countries. Placed on this chart, European Union countries in continental Europe come out at the top right, Anglophone countries on the middle right, Latin American countries on the bottom right, African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian countries on the bottom left, and ex-communist countries on the top left. Number 3. Cornell and the libertarian control and irrational rationalism spectrum. This very distinct 2-axis model was created by Jerry Cornell in 1963 for his doctoral dissertation in political science. The Cornell chart has liberty on one axis, with those on the left seeking freedom from control or protections for social deviance, and those on the right emphasizing state authority or protections from norm enforcement, farthest right being state worship, and farthest left being the idea of a state as the ultimate evil. The other axis is rationalism, defined here as the belief in planned social progress, with those higher up believing that there are problems with society that can be rationally solved, and those lower down skeptical of such approaches. Number 4. Mitchell, 8 Ways to Run the Country. In 2006, Brian Patrick Mitchell identified 4 main political traditions in the Anglo-American history based on their regard for kratos, as defined by the use of force, and antri, or ankri, as defined by the recognition of rank. Mitchell grounded the distinction of antri and kratos in the West's historical experience of church and state, crediting the collapse of Christian consensus on the church and state with the appearance of 4 main divergent traditions in Western political thought. So, the Republican constitutionalism is pro-atri and anti-kratos, libertarian individualism is anti-archi and anti-kratos, democratic progressivism is anti-archi and pro-kratos, and plutocratic nationalism is pro-archi and pro-kratos. Mitchell charts these traditions geographically, using vertical axes as a scale of kratos and akateria, and a horizontal axis of archi. He places democratic progressivism on the lower left and bureaucratic nationalism on the lower right, Republican constitutionalism on the upper right, and libertarian individualism on the upper left. The political left is therefore distinguished by its rejection of Archie, while the political right is distinguished by acceptance of Archie. For Mitchell, anarchy is not the absence of government but the rejection of rank. Thus, there can be both anti-government anarchists, Mitchell's libertarian individualists, and the pro-government anarchists, such as Mitchell's democratic progressives who favor the use of government force against social hierarchies such as the patriarchy. Mitchell also disguises between left and right-wing anarchists, whom Mitchell renames acratists for their opposition to the government's use of force. From the four main political traditions, Mitchell identifies 8 distinct political perspectives, diverging from a populist center. 4 of these perspectives, progressive, individualist, Pablo-conservative, and neoconservative, fit squarely within the 4 traditions, and 4 others, such as paleo-libertarianism and theoconservatism, communism, and radicalism, fit between the traditions being identified by their singular focus on rank or force. Number 5. Nolan economic freedom and personal freedom. The Nolan chart was created by libertarian David Nolan. This chart shows what he considers as economic freedom, so issues like taxation, free trade, and free enterprise on the horizontal axis, and what he considers personal freedom, so issues like drug legalization, abortion, and the draft on the vertical axes. This puts left-wingers in the left quadrant and libertarians in the top, right-wingers in the right, and what Nolan originally named the populists in the bottom. Another interesting model is the Sparta model. The Sparta model of voting plots voters and candidates in multi-dimensional space where each dimension represents a single political issue, subcontinent of an issue, and candidate attribute. Voters are then modeled as being an ideal point in the space and voting for the nearest candidate to that point. The dimensions of this model can also be assigned to non-political properties of the candidates, such as perceived corruption and health and other things in that arena. Most of the other spectra in this article can be considered projections of this multidimensional space into a smaller number of dimensions. For example, a study of German voters found that at least 4 dimensions were required to adequately represent all political parties. Now that we've analyzed the kind of basic political axes, I think we can begin to look at the political compass and analyze that as a form of political axes. So, in the interest of doing so, I went onto their website and I looked at the menu bar in an attempt to find a kind of about page, and I found 3 options, one being take the test, analysis, and your personalized certificate. I clicked on analysis, and after a bit of reading and a bit of clicking, I was brought to a page that said about the political compass. So, in the interest of answering the question, what is a political compass, I'm going to read the page to you. So, about the political compass. In the introduction, we explained the inadequacies of the traditional left-to-right line. If you recognize that this is essentially an economic line, it's fine as far as it goes. We can show, for example, Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Pol Pot with their commitment to a totally controlled economy on the hard left. Socialists like Mahatma Gandhi and Robert Mugabe would occupy a less extreme leftist position. Margaret Thatcher would be well over to the right, but further right still would be someone like that ultimate free marketer, General Pinochet. That deals with economics, but the social dimension is also important in politics. That's the one that the mere left to right scale doesn't adequately address. So we've added one, ranging in positions from extreme authoritarian to extreme libertarian. Both an economic dimension and a social dimension are important factors for a proper political analysis. By adding the social dimensions, you can show that Stalin was an authoritarian leftist, i.e., the state is more important than the individual, and that Gandhi, believing in the supreme value of each individual, is a liberal leftist. While the former involves state-imposed arbitrary collectivism in the extreme top left, on the bottom left is voluntary collectivism at regional level with no state involved. Hundreds of such anarchist communities existed in Spain during the Civil War. You can also put Pinochet, who was prepared to sanction mass killing for the sake of free market, on the far right, as well as in hardcore authoritarian position. On the non-socialist side, you can distinguish someone like Milton Friedman, who is anti-state for fiscal rather than social reasons, from Hitler, who wanted to make the state stronger, even if he wiped out half of humanity in the process. The chart also makes clear that, despite popular perceptions, the opposite of fascism is not communism but anarchism, i.e. liberal socialism, and that the opposite of communism, i.e. an entirely state-planned economy, is neoliberalism, i.e. extreme deregulated economy. The usual understanding of anarchism as the left-wing ideology does not take into account the neoliberalism of anarchism championed by the likes of Ayn Rand, Milton Friedman, and America's Libertarian Party, which couples social warning right-wing economics with liberal positions on most social issues. Often their libertarian impulses stop short of opposition to strong law and order positions and are more economic in substance, i.e. no taxes, so they are not as extremely libertarian as they are extremely right-wing. On the other hand, the classical libertarian collectivism of anarcho-syndicalism, libertarian socialism, belongs in the bottom left-hand corner. In our homepage, we demolish the myth that authoritarianism is necessarily right-wing, with the examples of Robert Mugabe, Pol Pot, and Stalin. Similarly, Hitler, on an economic scale, was not an extreme right-winger. His economic policies were broadly Keynesian and to the left of some of today's labor parties. If you could get Hitler and Stalin to sit down together and avoid economics, the two die-hard authoritarians would find plenty of common ground. So as we have read on this page, essentially what the political compass attempts to do is define people based off of regionalized other politicians. So we have the authoritarian versus the libertarian, and we have the left versus the right. And amongst that, the kind of level of where you would be based upon the policies of other prominent political figures. For example, authoritarian right is closest to Thatcher, so the closer you are to her values, the closer you'll be there. And similarly, the libertarian left is closest to Gandhi, and so the closer you hold his values, the closer you would end up there on the spectrum. Although already sounding rather unspecific, when you just take a blanchard look over it, it doesn't seem like there is anything problematic here. However, there is some criticism, as there is to everything in the political world. When you look at actual political platforms, they're not made out of any sort of sliding scale. The actual issues are often largely separated from each other and often rather binary when taken individually. We can easily imagine a stock US Democrat who's pro-gun or a standard US Republican who's pro-choice, and nearly as easily find actual people who fit those descriptions. Knowing that the Democrat is pro-gun doesn't really tell us much about her other beliefs relative to other Democrat thoughts, and we can't really expect that she's particularly pro-business for a Democrat or less enthusiastic about public health care than the rest of her party just from this gun thing alone. Even though these charts are usually two dimensions, there are hundreds of these largely separated issues, so we need hundreds of dimensions to be accurate. However, I can call someone a US stock Democrat, and have most of their positions. People tend to cluster their beliefs together and form parties and political movements. At any given time, there are actually unrelated issues that somehow get grouped together anyway, i.e. the pro-gun plus anti-environmental regulations. Those groups of issues change over time and from country to country. You can put them all on an axis and measure it and not get correlation, however. You're just actually measuring the truth about a particular political climate. You're not measuring some universal truth. The political compass breaks those hundreds of individual issues into two axes, the left to right and libertarian to authoritarian. That split worked really well in the US in 2007, particularly for explaining the way the Libertarian Party was pinching itself relative to the Democrats and Republicans at the time. It, however, doesn't do a good job of explaining where libertarians have moved to in the intervening 8 years, let alone anything else, but people still treat it as if it is a universal truth and a solid way of explaining all political dichotomies. The other problem is that it doesn't account for any of the reasons behind those positions. To take the firearms example, it doesn't differentiate between simply thinking it's unnecessarily interfering in other people's lives to restrict gun ownership or thinking gun ownership is an objectively good thing. Even the latter view groups of people who think more gun owners provide a check on state authority and others who see an unarmed or armed populace as good/bad pool of manpower for the state to draw on. Essentially, they are trying to qualify what are fundamentally qualitative issues. And furthermore, even back in 2007, the chart was biased towards putting everyone in the libertarian quadrant. Even though these charts are usually 2 dimensions, there are hundreds of largely separate issues, so we'd need hundreds of different dimensions to be accurate, as I said earlier. And even most of these dimensions cannot be answered by a simple yes or no question, and they can just be measured between something like a -10 or a +10 is also really inaccurate. In conclusion, the chart itself isn't so bad, and it actually is an interesting way of looking at the political spectrum, as in the left to right / authoritarian to libertarian dimensions can be useful in today's political climate. The test, however, is completely inaccurate in that it asks some bizarre questions and attributes them to either the left, right, or authoritarian libertarian axis in kind of dubious ways, as most of these issues are completely unrelated to one another. It also leaves a lot of issues out, and the questions it does happen to ask are often poorly worded or don't lend themselves to a simple strongly agree / strongly disagree answer. And there is also the idea that the political compass is fundamentally constructed as a recruiting tool for the libertarian movement. It asks loaded questions that all put you in the libertarian quadrant. It also places all establishment elites as being authoritarian, regardless of their actual beliefs, so that they can appeal to the populist sympathies of their target audience. There is a fundamental problem with the entire concept of the chart as well, actually. The traditional one-dimension left-right chart is not an objective measure of political ideology. It's an assessment of party group tendencies within an isolated political community. The 2 or sometimes 3-dimensional political charts that are popular all over the internet make the fundamentally wrong assumption that the objective ideology exists in ratios of adherence to a quantifiable set of principles. In reality, different ideologies think in completely different terms that are fundamentally foreign to each other. A liberal and a Marxist see the concept of equality in completely different and incompatible terms. They are not diametrically opposed, and there are ideologies that think of the concept in yet another way that's equally incompatible with either. There are no degrees of ideology except in people who try to reconcile cognitive dissonance, which is not uncommon among those without political education. When many different ideologies see that the world is in completely incompatible terms and they come together to form a government, they are forced to make compromises and ally themselves with those who prioritize similar policy, even if it's a different ideology or ideological justification. The nature of these groupings is fluid and best described as terms of no one-dimensional left-right chart. It makes no claim to be an objective prescription of ideology, just as a descriptive way to group factions that work together to make policy. Basically, people are struggling to find identity and appropriated a legitimate political science tool that was designed for a different purpose to do so. The minority groups, like libertarians, figured out that the linear model doesn't help them construct a separate identity from the greater party coalitions that have changed it to better support their ideological narrative. Now that we have the internet, everyone has started making their own derivative charts that support their ideological mythology. In reality, the chart says a lot more about the person who made it than it does about anyone who's trying to place themselves on it. So overall, I would say that the chart is, broadly speaking, an interesting way of looking at the political spectrum, and if you just look at the axes, it is possible to place yourself somewhere there, but the actual test in relation to the chart doesn't really work, which kind of deems the chart as nonsensical. However, that is just my opinion, and I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say about this. Perhaps you think that the chart is useful, and that having this already set bias could potentially allow people to open their minds up to other points of view. I'd be very interested to hear if you have another opinion. So, this is going to be the end of today's video. I would really appreciate it if you gave this video a thumbs up and subscribed. I post one new video every week, some in a similar vein to this, and I also have a literature series that I'm going to be continuing soon. I already posted one, like the first part. I analyzed the book The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, and yeah, I'm going to be continuing that very shortly. So yeah, please subscribe if any of that interests you, and thank you for watching today's video, and I hope that you subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and are gonna watch the next video. Thank you and have a nice day.